When he was less than a year old, Alejandro Mayorkas and his family came to the United States as refugees, fleeing Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. Today, he's the first immigrant to head the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. His portfolio includes everything from counterterrorism and cybersecurity to overseeing the Coast Guard and Secret Service. But it's what he's done or not done about the large number of migrants crossing the U.S. border with Mexico that's prompted protests by migrant advocates and fiery attacks by Republicans who want to impeach him. Tonight, you will hear from Secretary Mayorkas about the efforts to push him out of office and why he refuses to call the situation on the southern border a crisis. Early morning is often the busiest time for illegal crossings along the U.S. Mexico border. The day we went out with the U.S. Border Patrol near El Paso, Texas, was no exception.
They're headed towards the carousel.
Before meeting the cabinet secretary in charge of securing the borders, we got a view from the field. The Border Patrol reported over 2 million apprehensions in the past year, a record high. Some migrants surrendered themselves to border agents with the intention of seeking asylum. But the DHS estimates another 600,000 people evaded agents and entered the U.S. illegally, the highest number in over a decade. Which is why Secretary Mayorkas' testimony before Congress last fall raised a few eyebrows.
Secretary Mayorkas, do you continue to maintain that the border is secure?
Yes, and we are working day in and day out to enhance its security, Congressman.
Right. What the American people see is a border that looks to be chaotic, that looks to be porous.
Well, the number of people that are arriving at our border is at an extraordinary height. There's no question about that. But that is not unique to the southern border of the United States. There is a tremendous amount of movement throughout the hemisphere and, in fact, throughout the world.
The chief of the Border Patrol, Raul Ortiz, testified before Congress that some areas of the border are in a crisis situation. Do you agree?
I think that we face a very serious challenge in certain parts of the border.
Do you view what's happening right now on the border as a crisis?
I view it as a significant challenge.
Why won't you say the word crisis?
You know what? Because I have tremendous faith in the people of the Department of Homeland Security. And a crisis speaks to me of a withdrawal from our mission, and we are only putting more force and more energy into it.
Good morning, Secretary Mayorkas.
A lot of force and energy is now being directed at Secretary Mayorkas on Capitol Hill.
When you open up the border to the worst illegal immigration in our nation's history, people die.
This past week, Republicans took aim at the secretary, blaming him personally for the drug deaths of Americans, the rape of migrant children, and more.
How many murderers have you released into America?
Senator, I'm not aware of any murderer whom we've
So you don't know?
Senator, let me say something.
Do you know?
If you take a look at...
No, you don't get to give a speech.
Congress seems to be more interested in impeaching you than passing immigration reform. One member of Congress said he'd like to arrest you for negligent homicide for the deaths of young people from fentanyl. Another compared you to Benedict Arnold.
I disregard that type of rhetoric. I'm focused on the mission.
Do you think they're just trying to get you to resign?
I'm not going to resign. I love public service. I think it's an incredible honor to be a part of it.
How often do you and President Biden discuss the situation at the border? There's a perception that the president doesn't want to talk about the border.
That's a false impression that I consider to be also political rhetoric. I was with the president when he visited the border. I've spoken multiple times with the president. I, of course, speak with the White House team on a regular basis and with my colleagues in the cabinet. Absolutely.
The problems at the border didn't start with the Biden administration and likely won't end with it. Congress hasn't passed major immigration reform in nearly 3 decades. Secretary Mayorkas is asking Congress for additional resources on the southern border.
This is the first year since 2011 that we have added to the Border Patrol 300 more agents. The fiscal year 2024 budget calls for 350 more Border Patrol agents. more than $100 million in technological investments.
Is there anything that's off the table that you won't do to secure the border?
Well, the president, as I think you know very well, said we are not going to construct more wall that costs billions and billions of dollars, that is immovable, and that is already beginning to corrode.
Secretary Mayorkas joined the Biden administration with a resume seemingly well suited for the job. He'd been the top federal prosecutor in Los Angeles and deputy director of Homeland Security under President Obama. He was also a refugee whose Romanian mother and Cuban father fled Cuba when he was an infant.
I understand deeply the yearning of parents to give their children opportunities that America offers. We are a nation of laws. If people qualify under the law, then we embrace them. If they don't, then we return them.
The first weeks in office, the Biden administration halted deportations for 100 days, stopped all border wall construction, and suspended the Remain in Mexico policy. Critics say it all added up to putting a "come in, we're open" sign on the door.
I don't think that the more than 1 million people last year that we removed or expelled would consider the border open.
But the messaging, was the messaging wrong there that, we're open?
That wasn't our messaging, but that was the
But that's
messaging.
what migrants were getting.
Because remember something, that we are not the only source of messages that the migrants receive. We have smuggling organizations that exploit the migrants, and those smuggling organizations engage in mis- and disinformation.
In December, according to Border Patrol figures, an average of 1,800 migrants a day crossed the border into the El Paso area, overwhelming the city. To manage the increasing flow of migrants from crisis-stricken Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba, President Biden expanded the use of a public health law known as Title 42, invoked during the pandemic to expel migrants to Mexico.
Mexico has agreed to allow to return up to 30,000 persons per month.
At the same time, the administration unveiled new pathways for migrants to enter the U.S. legally. All the people in this line at a border crossing in El Paso scheduled an appointment with U.S. Customs and Border Protection by using a mobile app called CBP-1. Carla Delgado from Venezuela told us her family had crossed the Darien Gap, a dangerous stretch of jungle straddling Panama and Colombia, to get here. After a series of background checks and screenings, they were granted permission to temporarily enter the United States. By early afternoon, they enjoyed their first slice of pizza in America. They have friends in Chicago and told us they plan to build a new life there and apply for asylum in the U.S.
There's a backlog in the immigration system. We know only years from now will a judge figure out whether they actually qualify for asylum in the U.S. How is that arrangement good for them? How is that arrangement good for the country?
I would ask them, after they enjoyed their first pizza, how do they feel as compared to what they fled? You mentioned that their asylum claim may not be adjudicated, may not be judged for years. Our asylum system is broken. We need Congress to fix it.
The new policies have reduced the number of migrants crossing into the U.S. in January and February, but created a bottleneck on the other side of the border. In Juarez, Mexico, Monday night, a fire at a migrant detention center killed at least 38 men from Central and South America. Days earlier, at this women's shelter, we met families who'd been stuck in Juarez for months. Every morning at 9 a.m., women frantically try to refresh the government app, hoping to get an appointment to enter the U.S. We watch with Karina Braceda, who runs the shelter. By 9:05, all the appointments and hope were gone.
It's lottery with people's lives, with people's families, with people's livelihoods, with people's well-being.
The Biden administration says this is more humane than what was going on before.
It is not the most humane process because the most vulnerable aren't getting access to it.
Like Guadalupe Vasquez. She told us her husband had been murdered in southwest Mexico, and one of her sons had been shot in the eye and needed bullet fragments removed. She said she's been trying for 2 months to get an appointment to legally enter the U.S. I'm willing to wait to get an appointment, even if it takes long, she told us, but I'm going to make it.
If you're not able to get an appointment on the app, what's your plan?
I'll try to cross with a smuggler, and I'll cross with my children. We saw more desperation outside a nearby cathedral. Cristina Coronado runs a food program there. Juarez is in a moment of crisis, she told us. More than 10,000 migrants are now in the city, and most of them are sleeping in the streets.
As people wait here, are they getting frustrated?
Muy frustrados, muy enojados, muy confundidos.
Very frustrated, very angry, very confused. These men told us they'd been trying in vain for weeks to get an appointment on the CBP One app.
Oh, yeah, and it gets stuck, right?
One opportunity at 9 o'clock, no more. 5 minutes. 5 minutes not in here.
And then
try again next day.
And you have to wait for tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
We were in Juarez and we're surrounded by a group of migrants. Everybody's holding up the app, pointing to it, saying it's not working, and there's frustration. And the numbers are growing.
I will not represent to you, Sharyn, that it is flawless. But remember something, that to build a safe and orderly way, and we are continuing to build that. Remember where we were 2 years ago.
The Biden administration has reunited more than 600 children that were separated from their families at the border during the Trump administration. But now the secretary is facing what could be another defining moment for the country. On May 11th, Title 42, the pandemic-era public health order, will expire. That means without some new arrangement, the only illegal border crossers the U.S. could expel to Mexico would be Mexicans. Thousands of migrants are waiting at the border, and thousands more are arriving every day.
Has Mexico agreed to take back non-Mexicans if Title 42 ends?
So we are in discussions with Mexico with regard to how they will handle any increase in the number of individuals seeking to migrate north.
If Mexico doesn't accept other nationals, then what?
Well, we have all sorts of contingencies. I mean, that's what we do.
It's going to be complicated. It's going to be expensive.
It is going to be complicated. It is going to be expensive. This has been complicated, expensive, and challenging for decades.
For months, buses from the U.S. Mexico border carrying tens of thousands of men, women, and children from Central and South America have been arriving in New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. They were organized by the Republican governors of Texas and Arizona and the Democratic mayor of El Paso and paid for mostly by taxpayers. Greg Abbott, Texas's governor, said the buses would give liberal sanctuary cities a taste of what his state has had to deal with for years. Many of those coming to New York were Venezuelans, fleeing poverty, violence, and authoritarian rule, and hoping to apply for asylum. But the process can take years, and for much of that time, they aren't allowed to work. Caring for these new arrivals has been a big challenge, and it's drawn attention to a long-standing and bipartisan failure to fix the nation's broken asylum system. When the buses began arriving at New York City's Port Authority terminal from Texas without warning in August, city officials had to scramble. On some days, as many as 8 to 10 buses rolled in, filled with men and women carrying children, but no luggage. Last month, we met an engineer, a taxi driver, some college students, and construction workers. They were welcomed by Spanish-speaking volunteers from local nonprofit groups who gave them water and food and donated winter coats. Standing nearby, Lettuce Gomez was crying. She told volunteers she'd been separated from her husband and 18-year-old son by border officials in Texas. Her 7-year-old daughter was with her. To get to the U.S., like many Venezuelans, they'd made their way through 7 Latin American countries and a perilous stretch of jungle.
It was very difficult. because in the jungle we ran out of food and we ran out of water. And a child was shot. There were a lot of dead people. This is my first time emigrating, and I did not know humans were capable of so much evil.
How were you treated when you crossed the border in the U.S.?
Well, you can interpret my silence. You can interpret my silence. I didn't like being separated from my son.
Gomez told us she was thankful for the kindness volunteers at Port Authority had shown her. They'd even given her daughter a doll.
Thank you for treating us well. It's been a while since we were treated well.
Within an hour, the volunteers had found her son at a homeless shelter in Manhattan and brought him to Port Authority to reunite with his mother and sister. Lettice Gomez later found her husband too. Her family now lives in one of 58 hotels the city has turned into emergency shelters at a cost of about $200 a room per night. Unsure how many people would ultimately come and how much it would cost to provide them with food, shelter, medical care, and other services, New York's Mayor Eric Adams declared a state of emergency last month.
We are in a crisis situation.
This past week, Adams told us more than 22,000 migrants have arrived in the city so far.
This is a city of, 8 million people. Why would the arrival of 22,000 new people be such an emergency?
We're a city of 8 million people that just came through the pandemic. Many of our residents lost their jobs, they lost homes. We already had crises that we were navigating and dealing with.
Governor Abbott said that the buses would bring the reality of the crisis of the southern border to liberal cities, and it has done that, hasn't it?
No, I disagree with that. He created this humanitarian crisis by his human hands, his actions. There was nothing that prevented him from communicating with our team of saying, how do we coordinate this so we don't overburden another municipality?
His argument would be, well, we don't know when migrants are going to cross the border illegally, so why shouldn't these other cities get a taste of that?
Okay, is his fight with the national policy or is his fight with New Yorkers?
It is a stark reminder that the system is broken, is it not? I mean,
yes, and the system has been broken. We have kicked this can down the road.
Democrats, Republicans in Congress, nobody has clean hands on fixing this at this point.
More than 7 million people have fled the political, social, and economic chaos in Venezuela so far. It's the second largest refugee crisis in the world after Ukraine. 187,000 Venezuelans who crossed the border from Mexico into the United States last year have been allowed to stay here while they apply for asylum, but the process now takes years. More than 750,000 people from all over the world are already in line ahead of them, waiting for an asylum hearing or a final decision. Many more are waiting just for an opportunity to apply.
The asylum system has collapsed, yeah.
Teresa Cardinal Brown, a former immigration policy advisor in the Bush and Obama administrations, is now a managing director at the Bipartisan Policy Center, which tries to find common ground on major national issues.
There are, millions of people arriving to our southern border who are trying to seek protection, trying to avail themselves of our laws, and we just don't have the personnel, the resources, the infrastructure, or the right processes to manage what's happening there well right now.
Do you have a sense of how long it is? Somebody who's arriving just now at the Port Authority bus terminal in New York, how long it's going to be before they actually have an asylum hearing?
On average, people who are not detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement might wait 3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years. Are they allowed to work during that time?
No. Once you've formally filed your asylum claim in immigration court, 180 days later, then you can apply for work authorization. So it could be, 4 years, 4.5 years before you can ask for work authorization.
In the meantime, Brown says asylum seekers find themselves in limbo. They're here, but they can't legally work.
We don't come here to be a burden to this country. I come to work and push ahead.
Edward and Maria, who met in college in Venezuela, asked us not to use their last names out of concern for their relatives back home. It took them 6 weeks this summer to get to the United States with their 9-year-old son and 1-year-old daughter. They're now living in a hotel in the Bronx that was turned into an emergency shelter. But without work permits, they're struggling.
I found a job at a supermarket. I worked for 3 days, and he didn't pay me, nothing. I lost my time.
You got taken advantage of.
My fear is if I go to complain, he calls the police on me. And I thought, no, they'll deport me. And that was my fear, so I left it like that.
Like many migrants we spoke with, Edward and Maria no longer have their Venezuelan passports, ID cards, or birth certificates. They say they were told to hand them over to U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents in Texas and never got them back.
Well, they put it in a folder. They said, whenever you go to court, you can ask for them there.
That's interesting.
Teresa Cardinal Brown says U.S. Customs and Border Protection regulations are clear. All documents must be returned unless they're fraudulent. We interviewed 16 migrants who arrived in New York by bus from Texas. All but 4 said they had important documents taken and not returned. And volunteers, caseworkers, and lawyers who work with the migrants also told us the problem is widespread. In a statement, U.S. Customs and Border Protection said it was reviewing its policies and practices to ensure that documents are returned to the migrant absent a security or law enforcement reason.
So 90 divided by 9?
One bright spot for many migrant families has been the New York City public school system, which in a period of 3 months enrolled about 7,000 new students, most of whom don't speak English. 10-year-old Cesar Romborges now goes to PS 145 in Manhattan. His family made the long journey from Venezuela to Mexico and then crossed the treacherous Rio Grande River into Texas.
Do you remember what it was like coming here? Was it scary?
Yes, he says.
What was scary?
When my mom almost drowned in a river.
And you saw that happen?
Yes.
What are some of the things that go into different bins?
The principal at PS 145, Natalia Russo, says she's been doing her best to help Cesar and the other new students adjust. She does some students' laundry at her home and has made sure they have school uniforms, supplies, and help getting into after-school programs.
So what do you say to other families who see what's being done for
My answer
these new
to
kids?
that is that this is a humanitarian crisis. These folks don't speak the language. They're not part of this culture yet. Because we just want the children to feel safe, not only physically, but emotionally. And we'll do whatever it takes.
Cesar and other children of asylum seekers will likely be fluent in English by the time their parents have their asylum cases ruled on by a judge. And if they fail to make their case, they and their kids could face deportation.
How tough is it to make a case that you should get asylum?
It's very tough. It's very tough. The legal requirement is that you have to have been persecuted or have a well-founded fear of persecution.
So if somebody says, look, I'm coming here because I want a better life for my children.
That doesn't qualify for asylum.
So most of the people who are showing up at the Port Authority bus terminal saying that they want to seek asylum when they can get in front of a judge, most of them will not actually be granted asylum.
I can't say that for sure. What I can say is that overall asylum rates are about 30%. Venezuelans tend to have a much higher asylum rate because of what's happening in Venezuela.
In the past few weeks, the number of buses from the border arriving in New York has decreased significantly. That's because the Biden administration announced it was creating a legal pathway for 24,000 Venezuelan asylum seekers to enter the U.S. if they had sponsors. But it also began expelling Venezuelans to Mexico if they'd crossed the border illegally.
They basically went back to a policy that was put in place by the Trump administration, which allows for Venezuelans to be sent back to Mexico and not apply for asylum here in the United States.
I think that the national politics is well over my head on determining what we're doing nationally.
Do you think people who come to this country and want to seek asylum should be able to work while they're here waiting?
Yes, I do.
Doesn't that encourage more and more people just to come?
No, I don't. I don't think it creates a problem. What we should be asking is why is it taking so long? We should let people know right away, based on a preliminary review, you cannot get an asylum here in the country. And then those who are eligible and reach a minimum criteria, we could put it on a faster track.
The Bipartisan Border Solutions Act, introduced in Congress, would make that possible by adding more immigration judges and asylum officers and building 4 new processing centers along the southern border, where the government could determine whether migrants have a credible fear of persecution before they're allowed to stay in the U.S. Teresa Cardinal Brown, the former policy advisor in 2 administrations, says she'd like to believe Congress will finally do something to fix the problem, but she's skeptical.
For 30 years, they haven't passed really any substantive change to any of our immigration laws.
Is this a Democratic failure, a Republican administration failure?
It's both. At some point, they've got to decide that fixing it is better and necessary, more so than using it to try to win the next election.
This summer, an image of desperation was captured on the bank of the Rio Grande. If you saw the photo, you may never forget it. A father and his 23-month-old daughter face down in the muddy river. The 2 drowned trying to get to the United States. Like hundreds of others who have died trying to cross the river illegally, many of the details of their lives and how they died were either a mystery or reported incorrectly. But tonight, you'll hear from the only person who knows the story behind that photo, including the moment she saw her husband and daughter swept away. Her name is Tania Avalos, and last month in El Salvador, she told us her story. This is the photo that appeared on the front page of newspapers. A father with his young daughter tucked inside his t-shirt, face down on the bank of the Rio Grande. But this is the photo Tania Avalos wants you to remember of her family. That's her with her husband Oscar and daughter Valeria. It was taken on Valeria's first birthday.
It's okay.
Tania had not spoken to anyone about what happened to them, but she told us she wanted to talk about her faith. So that was our first question.
Tell me about your faith and how your faith has kind of guided you through the last few months.
Pues primero, quiero agradecerle a Dios.
First, I'd like to thank God, above all, for the opportunity He's giving me to share a message with the world so they can see and think that sometimes bad decisions are really painful.
Tania and Oscar met 5 years ago. She told us she was attracted to his quiet confidence.
Ask anyone, what's Oscar like? And they'll tell you wonderful things about him. God gave me a good man. He would say to me, I want to be a father. I want to be a father of a little girl. And I would say, calm down, I have to study. And so, at the end, we formed a family.
The daughter Oscar wanted so badly was born in July of 2017. Tania showed us family photos.
Oh, she looks like Daddy, too. So cute.
Here she is, a year old, trying to learn to pronounce her own name, Valeria.
¿Cómo se llama? ¿Cómo se llama?
Tell me about Valeria.
My daughter was an extraordinary girl, very intelligent. Everyone called her by her nickname, Culochita, because she had curly hair. She loved to dance. I would go to work. I had a job that took all of my time. And I would say, for you, my love. For you, we do all this.
The young family lived on the outskirts of San Salvador in a suburb called San Martin. It has the same problems as much of the country. A third of its residents live on less than $5.50 a day, and gang violence is rampant. El Salvador has the highest homicide rate of any country not at war. Tania and Oscar's neighborhood was controlled by the Barrio 18 gang, which demands protection money from businesses and some people's paychecks. Tania worked at a Chinese restaurant. Oscar at a pizza place. They lived in this small house with his mother.
What were your dreams for your family? What had you hoped? Why did you leave home?
Our dream was to move our family forward. Every human being has dreams. Oscar was a person who would say, I don't want my mother to have to work. I don't want my father to have to work. I want us all to get ahead.
Oscar, 25 years old, sold his most valuable possession, his motorcycle. And in March, the young family left El Salvador for the United States. Their first stop was the city of Tapachula, on Mexico's border with Guatemala. There, the family waited for a travel visa that would allow them to go through Mexico. To support the family, Oscar worked at a food stand for $7.50 a day.
We stayed for 2 months in Tapachula. Every day was a new day and a new challenge, but always in God's hands.
In Tapachula, Oscar met another Salvadoran, Milton Paredes. The four of them decided to rent a room together and later to make the bus trip to the U.S. border. Tania told us they didn't have any money after they spent $300 on the bus tickets. It took 32 hours to make the 1,000-mile trip. They arrived in Matamoros, Mexico, in the early morning of Sunday, June 23rd. The border town was a blistering waiting room for Central Americans hoping for asylum in the United States. According to data from the Department of Homeland Security, there was at least a 2-month wait to see a U.S. immigration judge. Even then, just 2 out of 10 Salvadorans meet the threshold to be granted asylum. Oscar, Tania, and Milton didn't know those odds when they got to Matamoros, and they'd spent all of their money. Soon after they arrived, they went to cross the main bridge that stretches over the Rio Grande to Brownsville, Texas. But Tania and Milton both told us they were stopped on the Mexican side by thugs who demanded $1,300 to pass over the bridge.
We probably spent a good amount of time walking around and thinking about what we were going to do. So we thought, let's cross the river, because we don't have any money to pay someone to get us across to immigration. Right then and there, we decided that we were going to cross the river.
This is where they went, the banks of the Rio Grande. Known in Spanish as the Rio Bravo or Rough River, here it's about 50 yards wide. America appeared to be in reach. Tania said they made the decision to swim across the river and enter the United States illegally.
We said to each other, the time is now. The time is now for us to do this.
Their improvised plan was to surrender to the U.S. Border Patrol once they got to the other side. Oscar swam across the river first to see if anyone would stop them.
He was signaling to us that no one was there. So then he came back because I was on the Mexican side with my daughter. I said to him, I'm scared. And he said to me, everything's going to be fine.
The surface of the Rio Grande appears calm, but emergency responders in South Texas told us the river's current can be unpredictable and ferocious enough to suck you under. Tania couldn't swim, so they decided Milton, who was a strong swimmer, would carry her on his back. Oscar decided to carry his daughter, Valeria.
He put our daughter inside his shirt. Obviously, he couldn't carry her on top because she might fall off. But since he was thin and his shirt was very big, our daughter fit perfectly inside. And he started to swim, and I followed behind him. And I saw him doing okay. I mean, he was close, very close. And I noticed him starting to get frustrated. I could see that he was coming up and going under.
Tania told us that in her panic, she was barely able to hold on to Milton as he turned back.
I swallowed so much water. I swallowed so much water. And I was desperate. And I got out. I got out on the Mexican side. And I could still see my husband there, struggling, along with my daughter. I saw her. I saw her. And I said, my God, my Lord, please get them out of there. And I just saw my husband giving me a glance. And then I couldn't see him anymore. I could not see him anymore.
That's Tania showing Mexican officers where she saw Oscar and Valeria last. Divers suspended their search at sundown.
They took me to the migrant shelter in Matamoros. When I walked in, I saw a lot of immigrants from different countries. And I started telling them, don't sacrifice your children. Pray to the Lord and He will give you everything you want. But don't emigrate.
Oscar and Valeria's bodies were discovered the next morning, washed up on the Mexican side of the river. A photographer was there and snapped the now famous photo, father and daughter in a final embrace. In the days that followed, the image became a global symbol of the crisis at America's southern border.
The photograph that all of us saw this week should tear all of us up.
It prompted a brief moment of bipartisan reflection for a Congress deadlocked on immigration.
I hope that picture alone will catalyze this Congress, this Senate, this committee to do something.
Within a week, Congress did pass an emergency multi-billion-dollar package to hire new judges and build facilities to deal with the surge of Central Americans at the U.S. border. Since then, the Congress has not passed any immigration legislation.
After this all happened, many people wrote to me. They said they were very sorry. Others called me names and told me that I was greedy, that I put my daughter's life at risk, that I didn't love them. And they made me feel so bad.
Since Oscar and Valeria died in June, the bodies of at least 52 more migrants have been found in the Rio Grande, 4 of them children. Most of their stories are unknown. This story ends with a 21-year-old widow and a modest memorial on the bank of the river. It reads, "In memory of little Valeria and her papa, Oscar."
Do you have family here? Are family supporting you? What is your life like now that you've been back?
I do. I have my mother and my siblings. I almost never cry at home because I'm afraid they'll feel bad. I hold it all in. But there are times when I just break completely. I cry all I have to cry. I wash my face and I go out and I go back to work and I keep going.
President Trump promised he'd crack down on illegal immigrants, and in his first 100 days has moved quickly to do just that. Since the president took office, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, says it's arrested 21,000 undocumented immigrants, more than 5,000 of whom have no criminal record. That's more than twice as many as the year before. The president's supporters argue his tough new policy has led to a dramatic drop in the number of people trying to cross into the U.S. this year. But it's also had a profound effect on communities throughout the country. For the past few weeks, we followed how the new policy has played out in one community in Indiana, where people were surprised to learn that one of those deported was a friend and neighbor, the owner of a popular local restaurant. He'd lived in this country for nearly 20 years, had no criminal record, and his wife and children are all U.S. citizens. Eddie's Steak Shed in Granger, Indiana is a local institution. It's a family-run restaurant where generations of Hoosiers have come for conversation and cholesterol. Seems like this is like your local Cheers.
It is.
But as we spoke with these regulars a few weeks ago, the man they said was the heart of the business, its longtime cook and new owner, Roberto Beristain, was behind bars, awaiting deportation. Beristain entered the U.S. illegally from Mexico in 1998, but in recent years he'd been issued a temporary work permit, a social security number, and a driver's license.
It just feels wrong.
The community is better for having someone like him.
I mean, he showed up here with just the shirt on his back, and he's a restaurant owner 20 years later. I mean, and he worked his butt off to get there. I've seen it.
They're all strong supporters of Roberto Beristain, though 4 out of 6 of them voted for President Trump. During the primaries, the president said this about illegal immigrants.
They will go out. They will come back. Some will come back, the best, through a process. And it may not be a very quick process.
And later, during the general election, he said this.
But we have some bad hombres here, and we're going to get them out.
I voted for him because he said he was going to get rid of the bad hombres. Roberto is a good hombre.
Roberto Beristain's wife, Helen, who also works the restaurant, was born in Greece and became a U.S. citizen 16 years ago. She met Roberto in 1998 at another restaurant in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
He was a busser and I was a server. He started talking to me a lot and I tried to ignore him. He kept on talking to me.
You tried to ignore him?
Smiling and smiling and smiling. He always smiles. Very positive person.
They got married, had 3 kids, and settled into a comfortable suburban life.
Has he ever been in trouble with the law?
Never.
Never committed a crime, DUI?
Definitely not, no.
He's not a criminal?
He's not a criminal. The only bad thing he's done is stayed in the United States because he loves this country. That's his only crime.
According to most estimates, there are about 11 million people living within the U.S. illegally. About 3% of them have felony convictions.
We prioritize criminals. We prioritize gangbangers.
For most of his presidency, Barack Obama ordered ICE to focus on deporting people convicted of felonies and serious misdemeanors. ICE agents were often asked to explain their decision to remove anyone else, particularly those whose family members were U.S. citizens.
Thank you for being here.
But on his 5th day in office, President Trump signed a new executive order that made it easier to deport people who have no criminal record, including anyone who has what's called a final order of removal against them. It's that wording that changed the Beristains' lives. That's because 17 years ago, Roberto and Helen, who was pregnant with their first child, took a trip to Niagara Falls. She says they made a wrong turn and ended up near the Canadian border. Roberto was detained for not having any papers. He was released only after he agreed to this immigration court order requiring his voluntary departure from the United States within 60 days. When he didn't leave, he automatically became the subject of a final order of removal, which mandated he be deported.
Your husband did break the law, didn't leave the country when he had told a judge that he would. Why should he get special treatment when other people who've been waiting in line are trying to do it the right way?
My husband, first of all, broke the law because at the time when I was pregnant, I was very ill and he was at a high risk, either losing the baby or losing my life. So the decision he had to make was between me and the baby or him going back to Mexico. He chose us. But any other man, what would they do in his shoes?
Helen says over the years they've spent more than $45,000 hiring attorneys to try to legalize Roberto's status. But it wasn't until 3 years ago that things started looking up for the Beristains. Roberto obtained a temporary deferral of that deportation order, which meant he could get a work permit, a social security number, and a driver's license. All he had to do was check in with the government once a year and prove he'd been in no trouble with the law.
He was excited. He says, I'm all legal now. I'm so good to go.
But it was still just a temporary status. He still had to check in with ICE every year.
Right, exactly.
On February 6, shortly after President Trump signed his new executive order, Roberto Beristain came here to an immigration office in Indianapolis for his annual check-in. Helen was in the parking lot waiting when an ICE officer came to let her know her husband would not be coming home.
He said, your husband is being detained because he is a fugitive. I said, my husband is a fugitive. My husband is not running from you. You did not come knock on my door to look for my husband. He came to you. Why this year he is a fugitive? What happened?
Roberto was doing everything he was supposed to do, so he was an easy target.
He wasn't hiding. He wasn't living in the shadows.
No.
Right, and so they grabbed somebody who was following the rules.
Most of you voted for Donald Trump. He said he was going to do this. He's done this. Why are you surprised?
Because this is not the person he said he would deport.
And why would you deport somebody like that when you got so many other bad people out there? It just doesn't make sense to me.
ICE declined to give us an interview, but in a statement, the agency said Berenstain was detained because of that final order of removal in accordance with federal immigration law. James Carafano, a policy expert at the Heritage Foundation and a member of Mr. Trump's transition team, told us the president's new policy is designed to serve as a deterrent.
It's not that they're going out and they're looking for people who have done nothing, but that we have an obligation to enforce the law, and if somebody comes across our path who's broken the law, then you know what? They're probably going to go, because the message is there's a new sheriff in town and the law is going to be enforced.
You're saying that deporting somebody like Roberto Berenstain, it does send a message to others who may be thinking about coming here illegally.
I think that's absolutely true.
The number of people caught trying to cross the southern border has dropped 60% in the first 3 months of President Trump's administration. Apprehensions are now at a 17-year low. Analysts we spoke to believe the president's tough new policies have discouraged border crossers, but so have other factors, including an improving job outlook in Mexico. The average cost of deporting someone like Roberto Berenstain is about $11,000. His odyssey through the immigration detention system gives you some sense why. Over the course of 2 months, he was moved from Indianapolis to Brazil, Indiana, Kenosha, Wisconsin, then Kankakee, Illinois, New Orleans, Louisiana, Chaparral, New Mexico, and Sierra Blanca and El Paso, Texas. His family often didn't know where he was going or why he was being moved there.
Tell me something. Did they tell you when they're going to deport you?
We were at the house one evening when Roberto called.
Okay. So wait a minute. They said, no, Roberto, they said they were going to take you to Mexico City. So now they're changing again? Okay. I love you. Be careful. Bye. Sounded scared. Honestly scared, like what's going to happen to me.
The irony of what's happened is not lost on Roberto's wife. Like a lot of her friends and relatives, Helen Berenstain also voted for President Trump.
You voted for him.
I voted for him because he said, we're going to make our economy better. I did like that idea, and I said to Roberto, I said, you know what? You know, you're getting a small business, and that's going to help you with your taxes. But he said, okay, well, you don't think he's going to deport us, all people? And I said...
Roberto actually raised that idea.
Yeah, he did. And I said, Roberto, come on now. You got your documents. You obey the law. You haven't done anything bad. You're not a criminal.
Are there times when you feel that you made a terrible mistake?
Like they say, you should read the fine print first before you make a selection. I should have listened closely to those debates. That was the mistake I made. I didn't listen.
The Berenstain's children, 8-year-old Dimitri, 14-year-old Jasmine, and 16-year-old Maria, have a difficult time understanding what's happened to their father.
Maria, did you know he wasn't a U.S. citizen?
No, I didn't know. He makes this home a home, and he makes a family, because he's, you know, the father. And when he's gone, when you take that away from a family, it's like, it's all going down. Like, for my mom, it's very hard, and for us, it's hard too.
What did he say to you when you were talking on the phone?
The first thing he said was, you got A's?
He was asking about your school.
Yeah. I'm like, yeah. And he's like, okay, good, because I want you to become a lawyer. I was like, yeah, I'm going to become a lawyer. An attorney, I'm going to be an immigration attorney.
Since Roberto Berenstain's detention has been in the news, the restaurant has received threatening calls and angry letters directed at Helen. Pack your bags and go to Mexico, said one. When you voted for Trump, you were voting for every bigot who's coming after you, said another.
You got people hating people left and right. This is not America. This is not the America dream. And this is not how we're making America great again.
On April 4th at 10 p.m., Roberto Berenstain was taken to this border crossing and deported to Juarez, Mexico. He spent the night at a shelter run by the Catholic Church. We found him there the next morning. He told us he was praying to be reunited with his family and was still somehow optimistic.
Wherever I go, they're going to be with me. Everything's going to be okay. Either way or other way, we're going to be together.
If I was told that peaceful immigrants that are in the process of becoming an American citizen would be deported, I would not have voted for Trump.
Some people say, look, illegal immigrants are coming here and they're taking jobs.
That's not even the case with Roberto. He employs, 20 people? He's not taking jobs, he's creating jobs.
Is it a good use of resources to deport someone like Roberto Beristain?
That is part of the overall public good of demonstrating not just to Americans, but to people around the world that American immigration laws are going to be enforced. That's an important message.
So there's no room for discretion?
Look, I don't enforce the law. I don't say there's room for discretion. I'm saying I don't necessarily think that just because somebody was nice in the 20 years they live here, that they have a right to live here.
Roberto Beristain's lawyers are challenging the validity of that old order of removal that led to his deportation to Mexico. They may also apply for a special waiver for him to re-enter the U.S., but that can take 2 to 3 years. If he's denied, he'll be banned from returning for a decade.
There is a peaceful rebellion growing against federal immigration law and the interpretation of that law by the Trump administration. More than 800 houses of worship across the country have volunteered to shelter illegal immigrants and their families who face deportation, daring federal agents to step through their stained glass doors. The churches and synagogues are joining more than 600 cities and counties that have declared themselves sanctuaries, ordering their police not to detain people if it's only because of their immigration status. In no other venue of the law has so much of the nation stood in defiance of Washington. Philadelphia's Arch Street Methodist Church was built by Abraham Lincoln's favorite minister.
We are a sanctuary church.
And 155 years later, Reverend Robin Heinecke is on the same chapter and verse.
By baptismal covenant, there's a vow that's taken either on my behalf when I was baptized as a child or as an adult, that I would take the power and the freedom that God gives me to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they show themselves.
Well, in your view, what is this? Evil, injustice, or oppression?
It's injustice and oppression, all of which is evil. Yeah, when a human being's human rights are denied, when they can't stay with their family, when they can't work, when they can't participate in the community in which they have deep roots, all of those apply.
He's talking about Javier Flores Garcia, who has lived in the church basement for 6 months. He came from Mexico illegally in 1997. He's a landscaper with a decade-old DUI on his record. His other offense is crossing the border repeatedly. A judge ordered him deported, but he moved here rather than leave his 3 children who were born citizens.
I think you have to keep fighting, and I'm doing this for my kids, and I would do it again if it became necessary.
We're taking a leap of faith, right, in many respects, because we don't know what's going to happen.
Federal agents can arrest Flores in the church, but U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, has a decades-long policy of avoiding places of worship, schools, and hospitals.
My advice would be they should come out of the basement of the churches and follow the law.
Daniel Ragsdale is deputy director of ICE. He runs the daily operations and oversees 13,000 officers.
So if they are to check in with ICE, they should come and check in with ICE.
Checking in with ICE is going to get them deported.
Checking in with ICE will follow the law. And in cases where there's a removal order, of course, we would execute it.
How much concern do you have about separating families in deportations?
As a human being, I know it is traumatic for folks. But I will also say that the rule of law is something that America is built on. But this seems to be the one area where the narrative about separating families, sort of gets a little bit ratcheted up.
Well, you can understand why.
Well, I can, but I would suggest that every person who has come to the United States illegally, just like if I went somewhere and resided in violation of law, I could expect at some point that sovereign country to want to remove me.
We're rounding them up in a very humane way, in a very nice way, and they're going to be happy because they want to be legalized.
Before the election, candidate Trump told us he would deport all of an estimated 11 million illegal immigrants.
And by the way, I know it doesn't sound nice, but not everything is nice. Thank you very much.
Now, President Trump says he's pursuing violent criminal immigrants first.
You see what's happening at the border. All of a sudden, for the first time, we're getting gang members out, we're getting drug lords out, we're getting really bad dudes out of this country, and at a rate that nobody's ever seen before. And they're the bad ones.
It's not just the bad guys. The fact is, in the Trump administration, according to ICE, about 11,000 undocumented people with no criminal records have been detained so far. That's twice as many as last year. Because of this, the number of religious institutions across the country offering sanctuary has doubled to 800. Just last week, this church in Buffalo, New York, offered sanctuary to a family of 6 from Honduras. The church has opened its doors to 40 illegal immigrants since January.
Blessed are you
when congregations in cities including Phoenix, Denver, and Philadelphia give sanctuary, they are in open defiance of immigration law.
That leads me to wonder whether there's any internal conflict within you. I mean, you preach morals, and yet you're breaking the law.
There's no conflict. I think I've said this before, that when a law breaks the backs of God's people, then it's time for us to think about breaking those laws.
Trouble is, those laws never stop changing. And that's one reason the immigration debate is never settled. Since 1790, Congress has rewritten immigration law on average about every 4 years. America imported Chinese labor to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and when it was finished, Congress banned all Chinese. In World War I, nearly 20% of U.S. forces were not citizens. In World War II, America begged more than 4 million Mexicans to come to work. And in 1986, Ronald Reagan granted amnesty to illegal immigrants.
Day one, my first hour in office, those people are gone.
Mr. Trump blames immigrants for violence. He often fired up his rallies by raising the murder by an illegal immigrant of a woman in San Francisco, a sanctuary city. But according to the Department of Justice, the incarceration rate for illegal immigrants is 1/3 that of citizens.
To lay criminality at the feet of immigrants is not only morally unfair, it is factually wrong.
One of Jim Kenney's first acts as mayor was to declare Philadelphia a sanctuary, which means his police do not ask about citizenship and will not hold illegal immigrants if the only reason is that ICE wants to deport them. He says it violates the Constitution to hold people without a warrant. There are more than 600 cities, counties, and states that consider themselves sanctuaries. 2 years ago, there were half as many.
We've ordered a crackdown on sanctuary cities.
President Trump is now trying to cut off federal funds from these sanctuary cities, but he's been stopped so far by the courts.
This is not a us versus them. This is we upholding the Constitution of the United States of America and asking them to comply with it also by presenting us with the proper judicial warrant so we can release that person to their custody.
The feds are talking about taking your federal money away. Yeah. And Mr. Mayor, I bet you can't afford that.
No, but think about the conundrum that this presented. If you accept the assertion that undocumented immigrants cause crime, which I do not accept and I think it's wrong, why would you defund police departments?
Well, you know, there are people shouting at the television right now saying if they came illegally, they shouldn't be here. It's a terrible thing, but they shouldn't have come.
Well, you know, Ellis Island opened in 1892. The bulk of Irish diaspora came to America in the 1840s. We didn't have papers either. We were undocumented. There was an anti-Italian slur when I was growing up in my neighborhood called WOP. That's without papers. If you come to the country without documents because you're starving in your country or you're being held hostage by drug dealers or you're afraid your children are going to be shot in the streets or on their farm, I think that that's self-preservation and self-survival. And any group of people would flock to America because that's been the historic place where people came to be saved.
This is my country. I'm working hard.
Sixto Paz would have been deported 10 months ago if he hadn't confined himself to Shadow Rock United Church of Christ in Phoenix.
Good morning.
Ismael Delgado moved in 4 months ago.
We came to work.
Paz crossed illegally in 1985. Under the policy of President Reagan, he was granted a work permit, which was revoked under the policies of George W. Bush. His 4 children are citizens by birth. His youngest is 5.
I spent 32 years over here, and I don't want to live in alone. And I pay my taxes for 28 years.
Paid your taxes 28 years?
Yes.
There are people watching the interview who are saying you shouldn't have come here.
When someone, you got hungry, you don't have a job, you don't have money, what do you want to do? I don't come to the United States to take vacation, man. I'm here because I had to. That's why I'm come over here, and I respect all the law. I respect the people. I'm working hard to do the best. I got a clean record, and I learn a lot over here. I learn a language. It's not I don't speak very well, but I'm working on that. And my son, my daughter, is a professional.
You have 2 older daughters who are medical assistants.
Yes.
They both graduated from college here in the United States.
Yes, sir.
Sounds like the American dream.
Yes.
If the priority is serious criminal offenders, why are we seeing deportation orders for little old ladies and middle-aged men who've never committed a crime?
So that's a great question. So if someone who is placed in removal proceedings goes through that entire process, again, all at taxpayer expense, and gets a removal order, if we encounter that person and that order has been litigated and challenged and due process has been met, it's odd that anyone would expect us to simply ignore all those decisions by lawyers, by judges, by federal court judges in some cases, and simply say, we're going to make policy on the street and ignore it.
One of the changes in the guidance from the Obama administration to the Trump administration is that President Trump's executive order prioritizes the removal of those who entered illegally. Well, that's everybody. That's 11 million people.
We only have the same size workforce. There's just no way that could simply be done in any rapid fashion, which is why we are still focusing on the folks that I talked about, which are people that present the greatest risk to public safety.
Javier embodies the spirit of sanctuary. He and we together are sanctuary.
Do you worry that the government might take steps against sanctuary congregations across the country?
I do worry about that. I think it would be a huge breach of the age-old traditions of providing, at least having some place in our civil society where there's an opportunity to challenge laws and policies and procedures that are creating more injustice than they are creating justice.
In rare cases, ICE officers have made arrests near schools and churches. A man was arrested in California dropping his child at school, and in Virginia, several illegal immigrants were arrested shortly after walking out of this church, leaving many to wonder, where are the lines once the border's been crossed?
Those are the laws that Congress has passed. I don't think it's anybody's question that if you don't have lawful status, that at some point you could be removed. And I think that's something that people should be aware of. And again, I think the president, when he announced the program, was pretty clear about that.